I'm an artist based in South Africa, in Johannesburg. Um, Basically, I mean, I'm not going to kind of go through all of my work, but I'm going to start with some basically where I began this body of work. So I'd been studying in Belgium for a few years, and I came back to South Africa in 2010, so just after the World Cup. And what had happened is the government in South Africa at that time had negotiated with the unions not to go on strike during the World Cup. But immediately following that, there was a massive kind of municipal strike that went on for about 6 to 8 weeks. It shut down most of South Africa, and I arrived back kind of at the beginning of this. And I'd been working on some things around on artworks that dealt with kind of the history of work and labor in South Africa. But at that point, I really started to focus on that as a way of kind of trying to understand what was going on in South Africa. So what was interesting about that strike was that in South Africa, the trade unions were really, really important in the anti-apartheid movement. So before, most political parties were banned during apartheid, or any kind of non-racial black political parties, any left-wing political parties, communist parties were banned. So before the unbanning of political parties in 1990, in 1979, trade unions were unbanned. And they played a really, really important part in kind of disrupting South Africa, bringing industry to a standstill, and really kind of forcing the government to transform and to hand over power. So they had played this kind of major role, and after 1994, well, in 1990, after the unbanning of the ANC and the unbanning of the South African Communist Party, the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and the largest trade union affiliation formed an alliance. So up until this point, from 94 until now, we're governed by an alliance that is the ANC, trade unions, and the Communist Party. So, I mean, Lazy Nigel is kind of the start of a kind of longer project around thinking around, I mean, it's in a series of works that also think around time away from work, but also thinking around other kind of ways of thinking around productivity. I mean, Ruan was quite an interesting guy. I mean, he's not I'm not quite suggesting that the answer to all our labor problems is to build cannons for fishing, but it was a kind of interesting moment in thinking around this guy who's kind of making these homemade contraptions and stuff, and how that kind of can operate as a different kind of way of thinking around. Like he kind of really self-identifies with this way more than his kind of day job. Like this like going fishing. He goes fishing in Mozambique, and he really uses it to fire like far past the waves. And so this is his big project. Like he's, I think, built like a huge number of them and developed more and more versions and what have you. But so, I mean, it was a kind of nice moment to kind of start thinking around those things. So I'm going to kind of change direction a little bit, because whatever inevitably ends up happening when you have video works is that time goes quite quickly. So I do want to show one other thing. It's a little bit different to some of the other stuff I've shown. So part of what I've been doing in the last few years is some investigations into migrant labor in Johannesburg. So really trying to think about how to understand Johannesburg. You kind of have to understand Johannesburg through migrant labor, because it's a city that's very young. It's only about 120 years old. It's founded because gold was found. It really grows up around those mines, and most of the labor is brought in from outside. About 30% comes from South Africa, 40% comes from South Africa on average during the 20th century, and the rest comes from places like Mozambique, Lesotho, a little bit from Zimbabwe, as far up as Zambia. I mean, the South African mines kind of figured out that it was much easier to draw from a kind of labor pool that's comes from kind of countries surrounding South Africa. So I'm not going to show you the whole thing. I'll show you an excerpt. But while I was investigating the problem of migrant labor, and I was kind of really starting to think about what happens when you have a kind of systemic thing of migrant labor. So when you create a system of migrant labor that creates a certain form of dependence and interrelation between countries. So what is the form of relationship between, for instance, South Africa and Lesotho? So while I was in Lesotho, I found out about, I mean, I kind of remember it from when I was a child, but I kind of came back to this incident when in 1998, so when Mandela was president, we invaded Lesotho. So South Africa invaded Lesotho and took military control of Lesotho. It was supposed to be in reaction to a coup that was happening to the government. It's complete bullshit. We went in to secure our water source. So Johannesburg gets 60% of its water from Lesotho. Our industry completely depends on that water. That year when we invaded, the water had just started flowing. They'd opened the taps basically to the water, and we were receiving. So about 6 months later, when this coup happened, and there also were questions at that time around why Lesotho was giving all their water to South Africa, we went in and invaded and propped up a government that had rigged the elections. So I managed to find someone who would speak to me about this invasion. The invasion happened in Maseru, which is the capital of Lesotho, but also at Katse Dam, which is the reservoir for the water that flows to South Africa. The invasion at Katse Dam is not really known about. There's no kind of military or tactical justification for why we bombarded the base there. But basically, while I was at Katse Dam, just kind of there, I met this person. I started speaking to him, and he agreed to do an interview. And after I'd done one interview with him, he kind of felt like he wanted to do a second interview. So he kind of retold the story to me twice. And I was kind of really interested in the differences between the two retellings. But one of the things is he only agreed to do the interviews that on the condition that he would remain anonymous. And so I had the material, and I had these kind of two really interesting, slightly different interviews that had a very different kind of way of telling the story. But he's kind of a well-known figure in Lesotho, and his voice is really well-known. So I couldn't really use his voice, and I couldn't really use his image. And I ended up working with an actor to reenact the interviews. So this is actually a reenactment of the telling of the story of the invasion of Katse Dam, or the bombardment of Katse Dam.
They convened on a daily basis. In fact, they would sleep by the palace grounds where the king resides. Because actually, according to our country's custom, when you are in trouble, the very first person you go to is the chief of the place. But because they were in Maseru, they had access to go not to the chief, but the king himself. They were there for weeks and weeks, singing political songs and shouting their political slogans. Absolutely, there was no fighting. There was no fighting at all. One day, the protesters took all the government vehicles they saw on the road and parked them at their respective ministries. Services came to a standstill. One could say the government was at the verge of collapse. Prime Minister Musisili appealed to SADC to intervene. South Africa entered the country and attacked Lesotho soldiers at their barracks in Maseru. Unfortunately, for some reason better known to the government of the day, the government decided to call SADC to come to their aid. Of all the military bases outside of Maseru, why did the South African National Defence Force single out the base at Katse? One wonders. Actually, the army was here. The army was based by the dam wall, the Katse dam wall, specifically to guard the wall. That was their duty for many years. I don't remember when they arrived here, but they have been here for many years on government service. And to show that that was what the government had planned that they do, make sure that nothing touches the wall. Because this is a high security point. So that according to the agreement of 1986, we as the country of Lesotho be able to transfer so much water into the Vaal Dam system.
It was at 6 o'clock in the morning on that day in September 1998 when the South African National Defence Force bombarded the base at Katse.
4 helicopters of South Africa flew over the village of Hakenene and Mansell in the direction of Tabesika Township. After a while, we thought they were far, far away. We could hear the sound coming closer and closer again. And we realized that we saw that the 4 helicopters had now turned and were coming in our direction. On the other side of Katse Reservoir, towards the river of Matsuku. They went over the hill and we couldn't see them again. And then they came again back, this time in the direction of the village of Hatiku, which is very close to the army base. And when the 4 helicopters now approached the base, they were in a single file, one following each other, 4 of them. The first one would start bombarding the base, hovering in a circle. The second one coming. This carried on for about 2 hours. And then they flew back in the direction of Maseru.
They left 16 soldiers dead, their bodies riddled with bullets, some bent beyond recognition.
Certain gains that they made around legislation, around work, really didn't change that much. And in a lot of ways, the trade union movement hasn't really been able to cope with that. So there is, I think, more critique around the system of work now, but it's only starting to gain momentum now as we're really starting to feel like 20 years later that not that much has changed, or certainly not enough has changed. So, I mean, this project of mine is kind of an ongoing thing that I've been slowly developing. What's been kind of important for a lot of of this kind of research is a series of essay films that I've been producing, which are these films, most of them are set in Johannesburg. They're really trying to sort of understand the condition of work in Johannesburg. There are 2, one that really looks at how work, the production of images of work in the context of Johannesburg, that tries to understand how certain ideologies of work came into play and certain ideas of work ethic, which really works with another piece that thinks around the relationship between the apartheid state and Calvinism, and how Calvinist work ethic was part of the kind of, was really built into the apartheid system. It was also built into the colonial system, but the way in which we value work. So the moralizing of work. Work is good for you, it makes you a better person, hard work is good for you, that kind of stuff really starts to become part of how the system of labor in South Africa is produced. It's part of the way in which certain policies around work and labor are produced. So, I mean, you can start to see how if you pay your workers terribly, but you believe that work has value in itself. So when you're treating your workers like shit, but you're saying, but actually this is making you a better person, allows for a certain kind of logic, particularly within the colonial and apartheid system of work, where workers are not really absorbed into society. So within a standard capitalist system, at least, I mean, until probably kind of the dominance of neoliberalism, there was still a kind of way in which the capitalist system took responsibility for the social reproduction of workers.